Hello and welcome to Under the Superscope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. Last time we examined The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass and found less than favourable results. The basis was fine, but the world and puzzle design left a lot to be desired. Puzzles would outright tell you the answer, the world would rarely provide contextual clues outside of text, and the Temple of the Ocean King was just the worst. But again, the basis was fine. Nintendo successfully transferred the structure of Zelda to a touchscreen, which enabled new and interesting ways to play the game. Items were given new life, combat was extremely accessible, and being able to take notes, while perhaps not executed properly, was a great idea. Phantom Hourglass isn't one of the worst Zeldas because of its form factor. There are so many reasons why I consider it to be at the bottom of the list, and for more on that, check out the last episode of Under the Superscope. But for now, what if I told you there were a game that reused the foundation and many of the ideas of Phantom Hourglass, one of the worst Zeldas, and turned it into one of the more memorable? This is The Legend of Zelda: Spirit Tracks. Spirit Tracks is a greater effort over Phantom Hourglass in essentially every single way, and while some may not care for the method of transport, allow me to show you the underlying design that sets this one radically apart from its predecessor. But before that, Spirit Tracks has something that doesn't need to be heavily dissected, and that's an engaging story with likeable characters and a clear motive. Phantom Hourglass took Tetra, made her into a generic damsel, and had you do a bunch of temples. That's kind of the entire gist. Spirit Tracks, on the other hand, takes place in the New Hyrule, which Wind Waker's Link and Tetra set off to discover at the end of Wind Waker. This is a brand new world with a vibe all its own, and holding it all together is the Spirit Tracks. We've seen so many takes on Hyrule over the years, but a fresh slate allows Spirit Tracks to truly dive out of its comfort zone. And while there's still a castle town and a Princess Zelda, the premise is unlike anything else. The princess's chancellor is plotting a scheme, and if his evil sneer wasn't enough to persuade you of that, his eerie theme song just might be. Oh, and the fact that Zelda tells you. Here's where the stakes come though. Zelda dies. She's not kidnapped, she's not turned to stone, she's not put into a giant diamond prison. She's dead, and the chancellor needs time to use her body to revive an ancient evil. This may sound like some kind of damsel plot, but while Zelda's body is dead, her spirit certainly isn't, and in this game, Zelda actually accompanies you from beginning to end. She has multiple purposes for gameplay, but in terms of story, she acts to remind you of your motive. The game does this in a few ways. When riding in the overworld, no matter where you are, you can almost always see the remaining floors of the central dungeon just swirling in the sky. You can take a detour for hours trying to find rabbits, but whenever you look up, you'll remember where you have to go. The premise is so much stronger than Phantom Hourglass and is packed with likeable characters and callbacks to previous Zeldas. Even Phantom Hourglass's only redeeming character, Linebeck, is present, his awesome theme and all. This narrative is all tied together with one of the best soundtracks in the series, and while this incredibly dull one from Phantom Hourglass is back, it makes up for it with a host of other tracks, and almost all of them are outstanding. The overworld theme in particular might be one of the best Zelda tracks, period. You can enjoy this track while riding on the tracks. This is a show about working out the inners of game design, but Spirit Tracks' narrative provides such a strong first impression and really highlights the sense of adventure. Phantom Hourglass feels like it didn't really matter with its vague dream aesthetic and no payoffs, but Spirit Tracks is constantly trying to hook the player. So is that it? It simply has a better story and soundtrack? Far from it. Spirit Tracks is so much more intelligent with its puzzles and progression, and what's interesting is many of Phantom Hourglass's puzzles return, only they've been completely revamped. One of the first traditional puzzles both games throw at you is this very simple, pull the levers in this order puzzle. Only in Spirit Tracks they're switches. So what's different? Well, in Phantom Hourglass, you'll have one tablet telling you, when pulling the levers, second first on the left, last second on the right. So of course you pull up your map and draw a 2 on the first lever and a 4 on the final lever. And then you read the next tablet telling you the rest of the order, and the puzzle's done. You're literally just writing down their answer. Spirit Tracks, on the other hand, has 4 completely separate tablets, and one will read, hit the right switch before the top one. You're not given a number or an order to do things, and based on that one piece of information, you can't really solve the puzzle. So of course you read all the others and process exactly what you're being told. And this is where the note system really comes into play in a way that Phantom Hourglass never allowed it to. No longer are you just copying down the answer, but instead scribbling around and making notes that only you understand, but they assist you in processing exactly what the game wants from you. This may be a very early example of a puzzle, but Phantom Hourglass reuses this very answer distribution right up until the end of the game. Puzzles almost constantly come down to reading a tablet and doing what it says. Basically, all the ideas that Phantom Hourglass tipped its toe in but ended up running away screaming from are all here and properly fleshed out in Spirit Tracks. It even expands upon the utility of items and constantly introduces new ways to execute simple mechanics. Let's take the first dungeon for instance. The main item of this dungeon is the whirlwind, which unleashes a gust of air when you blow into the microphone. In the previous episode, we criticised Phantom Hourglass for making poor use of teaching the microphone features. Rather, there's just the tablet telling the player to blow. Here in Spirit Tracks though, several items revolve entirely around blowing into the microphone. It makes the mechanic far less jarring. So where we once before blew out candles with little visual feedback, we now have an item dedicated to the motion, and we're also encouraged to blow when playing the spirit pipes. They're kind of this game's take on the ocarina. A little bit more on that later. So what's interesting about the first dungeon is it gives us a preview of how rapid Spirit Tracks is with its ideas. Basically, the distribution of a dungeon's item happens within mere minutes. What the dungeon will often do at first is find a substitute way to have you solve the puzzle before granting you the item. It will then find more obscure ways to tackle variations of that same puzzle. So this dungeon opens with a nut on one side of the room and a switch on the other. So the solution here is to pick up the nut and throw it at the switch. This is getting us used to working with distance, which is one of the key properties of the whirlwind item. We then run into some purple fog, which we can't quite clear in our current state. What's interesting about this is Phantom Hourglass hardly ever, if ever, had this kind of backtracking in dungeons. There are multiple instances in Spirit Tracks where puzzles aren't closed off into single rooms and instead span across floors. This is just one early example. And then after a room full of enemies, oh, you got the whirlwind. Told you distribution is fast. We're locked in a room with this mechanism until we can work out the utility of this item. And then onwards to the next puzzle. This one incorporates the distance trick we encountered right at the start of the dungeon, only this time we're using the whirlwind to extend our reach. There are tiles on either side of the key as visual indicators to encourage you where to stand. If you want to go back and clear that fog, well, now's the time to do so. Doing this will reward you with one of the game's many collectibles, a stamp, and 100 rupees. It seems Spirit Tracks still has the carefree money problems of Phantom Hourglass. No matter what way you cut it, the first dungeon is far too early to offer such a hefty reward for such little action. There are still some portraits that carried over from the first game. Anyways, next we're locked in a room with enemies that can only be defeated using the whirlwind. This adds a combat property to the item. We then get a more direct echo to the original puzzle using the very same nut and switch activity, only this time we have the whirlwind which carries over the nut for us. We also have the same tiles to line up our shot, just like the key from earlier. Now here's something actually overlooked in Phantom Hourglass. Mini-bosses. The prior game didn't have any, but that's something that's brand new for Spirit Tracks. What's interesting is most Zelda games will use a mini-boss as a way to give the player the item of that dungeon, but we've already had the whirlwind for quite a while. Some mini-bosses still stick to that trope, but this one right here is testing our combat utility of this item. We simply need to reflect the skulls back at him, which for the sake of clarity were the same skulls that we already know are weak to the whirlwind. So far, the whirlwind has been a tool to blow up mechanisms, extend our reach, stun enemies, and reflect projectiles. But there's one more use right at the end which merges the whirlwind and bombs. Zelda games will often use bombs as part of the environment before giving them to the player as a free-range item, and here we're able to mix the destruction of a bomb with the push of the whirlwind. Perhaps it would have been good to have a step of just teaching bombs on their own first, but it seems the dungeon wants everything to revolve around the whirlwind. This is quite an important step as we'll be seeing these bombs a few times more in the climax of this dungeon. The entire dungeon has basically been leading up to this one puzzle. We had the distance of the nut, the blowing to get the key, the mix of blowing at the nut, and finally a mix of blowing and the bomb. Another thing I complained about in Phantom Hourglass is how boss keys are now items that you carry, but they're always right by the boss door. Well, there's a little more purpose for this now in Spirit Tracks. Each boss key now comes with a hurdle or some kind of interceptor that warrants the trek from the boss key location to the door. In this one, we simply have to follow this line drawn on the map, which admittedly is a rather basic puzzle, but it's a little more involved than just throwing the key into the lock with no danger. Now onto the boss of the dungeon. A modern Zelda boss should do two things. First, make great use of the combat properties taught of the item, and secondly, incorporate the dungeon's core puzzle gimmicks into the fight. This one ticks both of those boxes. The first phase has you simply running around to his back to blow out the purple mist, which is something we've of course done already in the dungeon, and then the second phase uses bombs, something that should still be very fresh in the player's mind. It's not a tricky boss, but it's one that culminates everything the dungeon has taught you so far, and all in all, as a first dungeon, the Forest Temple is pretty brilliant. It's certainly brief and rapidly paced, but there's no filler, and each puzzle naturally evolves on what came before. Dungeons in Phantom Hourglass were by no means bad, but they could often run out of uses for the item of that dungeon, yet alone finding new properties for older ones. Spirit Tracks on the other hand will have you juggling your items constantly, and there's always some surprising new function to be uncovered. The Ice Temple has 3 main gimmicks, and while items tie them together, each stand on their own but are slowly introduced to each other. There's block pushing puzzles, musical notes, and building paths across water. Similar to the previous temple, the puzzles begin before the item of the temple is distributed, but also just like the previous temple, it does not take long to receive it. We start off and there's a block that we simply have to push into a crevice right in front of it. Once in the crevice, we then have to ring to a specific beat. We can either just hit it a few times out of curiosity, or read the board ahead showing musical notes. This right here echoes the mechanics of the dungeon, and while we don't need to think about it, it's setting us up for a more complex encounter. One thing I really like is the central lobby in this temple holds the entire dungeon together. Phantom Hourglass only really had one dungeon that attempted this, and even then it was very light. Puzzles also aren't undermined with the immediate shortcuts like in Phantom Hourglass. There's a way more consistent flow to how rooms tie together. Right around the corner, we have a lonesome but more complex block pushing puzzle. And then we get something that I really like, further development of the whirlwind item. We have to time our propulsion of the enemy's projectiles with enough accuracy to carry them over to the switch. It's not crazy different to the bombs from the previous temple, but it's another use we haven't quite seen before. That's not the only use though, as we then have to use the whirlwind to push ourselves while sitting on top of a block. This is cleverly taught with a mechanism sitting right in front of you to blow on, which of course has the double effect of pushing you backwards. This one's quite a radical new mechanic, and it's not the game just trying to throw new uses to an existing item, but it's setting us up for a more evolved take using the next item, the Boomerang. In Phantom Hourglass, the Boomerang would hit switches, carry flames to light torches, and stun enemies. All those features carry over to Spirit Tracks, but of course, just like every other aspect of the game, with more layers. Base mechanics are taught as they usually are. We're locked in a room and encouraged to learn the core use of the item with these switches, but then we're given a new use, and this is where all the mechanics start to merge. Just outside the door, there's an expanded music sheet to take note of, and another block with a bell to push. Now here's the part that I really love. You'll most likely try to hit the bells a few times with your sword, just like last time, but this won't do anything. Soon it will click with you that there can't be lulls in between notes. And so what items can be used to rapidly hit consecutive objects? The Boomerang, of course. This is yet another example of providing hints without spoon-feeding the answer to the player. Phantom Hourglass had a puzzle where you were simply given the order of torches to light and then follow those exact notes. We're still given an order, but we first have to translate those notes and then find out how to execute the function, very similar to those tablets from earlier. And speaking of lighting torches, hey, look what's coming up! Spirit Tracks certainly does reuse Phantom Hourglass's puzzles, but again, we're uncovering the answers ourselves this time, and this puzzle also blends into what's coming next. So here we have a bunch of unlit torches circling a flame. Naturally, you'll try lighting the others, only to find the order was not correct. However, while carrying the flame, you have melted some of the snow surrounding you, and almost certainly revealed some patterns hiding in the snow. It's then as simple as melting the remaining snow to discover the correct order. It's not too different to just reading a note, but there's far more player interactivity this time. And then the act of using a boomerang flame to manipulate the environment is used for the remainder of the temple's puzzles. So while it's reusing a puzzle from Phantom Hourglass, it does it smarter and has so much more use for it. In the next room, our path is blocked by a body of water, just like in previous rooms. Only this time there's no block to sail on. There is a white flame however, so we'll naturally try to mess around with it using the boomerang. Doing so creates a path of ice on the water, which we can use as a path forward. So that simple torch puzzle from before was not only better executed than Phantom Hourglass, but it served the double purpose of teaching us to carry flames with a boomerang. We then get the usual combat utility for the mechanic by melting these enemies, and then we demonstrate our understanding of the two different flame properties. The ice one gives us a path forward, and the fire one melts ice. We also bring the whirlwind back, which isn't at all jarring as it formed the basis of a reasonable chunk of this temple. Just like in the last temple, we get one final echo puzzle which spans every core element of this temple. Firstly, we enter this room with a similar flame in the snow setup. Uncovering the snow gives us the final notes for the bell puzzle. We then need to manipulate the final bell back to the lobby room. But to do so, we have to master the block pushing puzzle and use an ice flame to build bridges across the water to carry it. We then finish off with a beautiful musical number. Astonishing. Just like last time, there's a bit more of a process to getting the boss key. There's a light puzzle where we distribute both a red and white flame in the correct order. We use the boomerang as an offensive item, and then we finally use the whirlwind once more to blow the boss key across a pedestal. Another callback to the core mechanic. The dungeons were the better part of Phantom Hourglass, but they still pale in comparison to the puzzle foreshadowing and gradual building blocks offered by Spirit Tracks. I also love how your mastery of an item from the previous temple was brought back into play and given a vital role in the next. It's something a lot of Zelda games struggle with, but Spirit Tracks nails it. In terms of the structure progression though, the two games are very similar. After each dungeon, you have to return to a central dungeon which unlocks a new chunk of the overworld. Skyward Sword kinda did this too, apart from it cut out the central dungeon bit. Here's the thing though, you don't need to play through the same rooms like a half dozen times in Spirit Tracks. But of course, if you were just coming to another dungeon after a previous dungeon, that would result in some questionable pacing, and that's why the Tower of Spirits has a different rule set. These are essentially co-op dungeons where Zelda possesses the soul of one of the menacing phantoms. The two of you then work together to make it to the top of the tower segment. In one of Phantom Hourglass's dungeons, this idea was explored for a few minutes, but never really went anywhere. And I love that the game actually teaches these co-op mechanics in the opening act. In the Tower of Spirits, Zelda as a phantom is used to distract guards as Link runs past, but in Hyrule Castle, Link distracts the guards as Zelda sneaks past. It's a great way to get you understanding both sides while teaching the core mechanics. There's also a unique twist to each of the tower's segments too. The first one essentially gets you used to Zelda's mechanics. She can walk over spikes, distract guards, and hit switches that Link otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. However, the second visit is all about lava. Link obviously can't stand in it, but Zelda can, and so you have to use both of the character's strengths to manipulate through the lava pools. I like how the final segment ditches the lava, but keeps the mechanic of Zelda carrying Link. There's some awesome totem battles, and we even use the whirlwind again. The Temple of the Ocean King had a lot going against it. You had to do the same content far too much, it was timed, you were forced to play it slowly, and it was generally uninteresting with its puzzles and aesthetic. While the Tower of Spirits serves a similar purpose with its pacing in the adventure, the execution couldn't be more different, and that's primarily contributed to the mechanics of each tower segment. The Temple of the Ocean King would change things up with new enemy types, but the underlying principles were always the same. This may be similar in purpose, but really they're completely different. There are some elements where the verdict is certainly up for debate though, and one of those is of course the train itself. There's a dedicated rope that goes choo-choo, so it's all good, end of. Alright fine, the train is mixed. I don't think the on-rails progression is really a step back or forward from the boat in Phantom Hourglass. In both of these games, you plot out your path and then simply go. In Phantom Hourglass, you'd have to tap on enemies every few seconds on your way to your destination, but unless you were exploring all of the world looking for undiscovered lands, there isn't much more to it than that. In Spirit Tracks though, you can relax a bit more, as enemies don't appear anywhere as frequently. Instead though, you occasionally need to glance at the top of the screen to see exactly where the phantom trains are. These circle around the overworld, and you basically want to avoid bashing into them, and so your route may adapt on the fly by changing the rail that you're on. Traversal is a bit longer than Phantom Hourglass, but it also isn't as mindless. The Wind Waker had a nice balance where you can either sit back and just take in the ocean, or go and do something else. But Phantom Hourglass wouldn't let you do that with how frequently enemies appeared. Spirit Tracks sits between the two. You can often sit back for large amounts of time, and you only really need to pay attention when you hear the rail signalling tone, or the less frequent but still present enemy theme. This isn't to say that either of them offer engaging forms of transportation, but I do think Spirit Tracks does it a little better. Well, most of the time. The game does an excellent job at cutting out the padding of Phantom Hourglass until certain points where it stops off at Paddington Station. There's this one point where you've cleared another portion of the Tower of the Spirits and need to make your way to the next part of the world, only to find a bridge has collapsed. You then need to ride the train back to a builder you met in a previous part of the world, pick him up and ride back, only he's a fussy passenger, and you have to abide by all the rail signs, which means you have to travel slower. Once you drop him off, you then have to find a treasure while he fixes the bridge. Go to an island, there's nothing there. Go to the next island, which is home to a sage, he's not there. Then you go back to the previous island, and now magically the sage is there. And then you go back to the sage's island, and yes, that's a lot of steps to get to one spot, and most of it feels like a waste of time. Padding's a tricky thing to define in Zelda, as downtime between dungeons doesn't have to be padding, but when you're going back and forth like this, you can certainly feel a drop in quality. That's what padding is. Lots of mundane tasks where it feels like you're running on the spot and not progressing at all. There's not enough of this for it to break the overall pacing of the game, but there are certainly instances of interrupted flow. And in fact, despite having far fewer temples, Spirit Track clocks in as a longer game than Phantom Hourglass, perhaps also factoring in more story and longer travel though. I always find that quite remarkable, as by all means and purposes, Spirit Tracks feels like a quicker game. Outside of a few small circumstances, you're pretty much always moving on to the next place. There's certainly a bit of a formula. Once you've uncovered part of the world, you then need to find a sage who opens up the path to the temple, and then you go forth. Getting to the sage is where the on-land adventure comes into play, and while some have far more elaborate setups than others, all of them have really clever puzzle designs. A lot of these showcase why Spirit Tracks made far greater use of the note system. This one right here, for instance, needs you to make it to the other side of the room without being spotted by these statues. So of course you map out exactly where they are and where they're staring before making your path. Phantom Hourglass also had a puzzle revolving around mapping out objects, but it was as simple as drawing a line between 3 trees. In a way, it feels like Phantom Hourglass set out to utilise the DS's unique features without truly thinking about how to balance them. Yeah, you take notes a lot, but you're not doodling your own thoughts, you're copying answers. Spirit Tracks, on the other hand, makes far greater use of touch, notes, and blowing. However, maybe we should take another look at that last one. The whirlwind item works great, but it's not the only use for blowing. There's also the spirit pipes. Now I'm always a little torn on these because they really don't have much purpose. There's only a few instances where you're required to use them, so they're nowhere near as integral as the ocarina. That said, every time you meet up with the sage, you have to perform a song with them. When it's just 2 notes that are right next to each other, it's flawless, no problems. But when there's a gap between the notes though, the game seems to have trouble recognizing the input, and so you may spend quite a lot of time trying to get everything to register. This especially breaks the pace in a sequence right before the final boss. Perhaps the game would be better without the spirit pipes, but there's something satisfying about watching your song play out after nailing a sequence, and the music is phenomenal. A great sequel improves upon what came before while keeping the best parts intact, and in that respect, Spirit Tracks is one of my favourite sequels in the industry. It perhaps lifts a tad too many attributes from Phantom Hourglass, but the underlying point is it does all of them far better, and frankly, it's one of the most charming games in the entire series. I mean, there's a dedicated choo-choo lever, you can't beat that. The best part about the Zelda series is almost all of them are brilliant for different reasons, and while I think Phantom Hourglass is an exception to that, I certainly don't have that same view for Spirit Tracks. Not only do I think Spirit Tracks holds up, but I don't think it's given enough credit for all the tremendous things it does so well. Taking some of my least favourite Zelda puzzles, bringing them back and making me love them is a tall order, and Spirit Tracks truly stays on the rails. But what do you guys think of Spirit Tracks? Let us know in the comments below, and of course be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for a lot more from Under the Super Scope and other things gaming too. Until next time, bye!